There are some graves that teach you things you never wanted to learn. My name is Director Walsh, and I've been running Willowbrook Cemetery for 23 years. In that time, I've seen every kind of grief, every variety of remembrance, and every strange ritual families create to honor their dead. But I've never seen anything quite like the woman who visits Plot 47B. She started coming on a Tuesday in late September. I noticed her first from my office window, an elderly woman in a cream-colored coat, moving slowly between the headstones with purpose. She carried herself with the careful dignity of someone who spent decades learning to bear sorrow gracefully. White roses in her left hand, a small folding chair tucked under her right arm. She walked directly to Plot 47B, set up her chair, and sat quietly for exactly 1 hour. This became her routine. Every Tuesday, 2:30 in the afternoon, rain or shine. She never spoke to anyone, never acknowledged my groundskeepers when they worked nearby. She would place fresh white roses on the grave, sit in contemplation, then fold her chair and leave. Her visits had the quality of a sacred ritual, something both personal and profound. I found it beautiful, honestly. In my line of work, you see a lot of grief that turns bitter or fades too quickly. This woman's devotion felt different, steady, enduring, like a lighthouse beam that never wavers. I made sure my staff gave her plenty of space. Some griefs deserve to be witnessed from a distance. After a few months, curiosity got the better of me. Not about her identity. I've learned to respect the privacy of mourners, but about the grave itself. Plot 47B sits in our older section, where the headstones date back to the 1940s and 50s. I wanted to make sure we were maintaining it properly, given how much it clearly meant to someone. I pulled the burial records on a quiet Thursday morning. Plot 47B was registered to a man named Edmund Cross, interred in 1951. The paperwork seemed straightforward enough, though I noticed the handwriting was different from our usual record keeper's careful script, probably filled out by his predecessor, Mr. Henley, who'd retired before I started working here. But something nagged at me. The plot looked wrong. Somehow the grass grew differently there, lusher and darker than the surrounding area. I'd been in the cemetery business long enough to recognize the subtle signs of settled earth, the way soil looks when it's been undisturbed for decades, versus ground that's been recently turned. Plot 47B looked like untouched soil. I decided to check our physical records against the digital database we'd created in the late 1990s. Most of our older burials had been transferred accurately, but occasionally we'd found discrepancies, clerical errors from decades past, plots that had been reserved but never used, bodies that had been moved to accommodate family requests. The computer showed no burial record for Plot 47B. According to our digital files, that section of ground had been reserved but never occupied. I pulled the original paper files, going back through decades of careful records. There was Edmund Cross's burial information, written in faded blue ink. But when I compared it to the surrounding entries, the handwriting didn't match. The paper was the same age. The ink had faded at the same rate, but something about the letter formation looked different. Too careful, maybe. Like someone had been copying rather than writing naturally. Tuesday came again. I watched the woman take her familiar path to Plot 47B, carrying her white roses and folding chair. This time, I decided to check the headstone itself. After she left, I walked over to examine the marker more closely. Edmund Cross, beloved father, 1908 to 1951. The stone looked authentic, weathered granite, with the kind of moss growth you'd expect from 70 years of weather. But when I knelt down and ran my fingers along the edges, I could feel that it wasn't quite level. The stone had been placed, but not with the precision our monument company typically used. I called our current monument installer, Jimmy Rodriguez, and asked him to come take a look. Jimmy's been setting stones for 15 years, and before that he worked with his father, who'd been in the business since the 1970s. This stone wasn't set by anyone I know, Jimmy said, after examining it for 20 minutes. See how the base isn't properly seated? and the angle's off by about 3 degrees. Whoever put this here did decent work, but it wasn't a professional installation. The ground probe told us what I was beginning to suspect. Jimmy's equipment can detect the presence of buried objects 6 feet down: coffins, vaults, even old wooden boxes that have mostly decomposed. He ran the probe over plot 47B in a careful grid pattern. "Nothing here," he said, staring at his equipment with a puzzled expression. "I mean nothing. No burial vault, no casket remains, no disturbance in the soil layers at all. This ground's never been dug." I stood there looking at the headstone, thinking about the woman who'd been visiting this empty grave every Tuesday for months, leaving flowers for someone who wasn't there, sitting vigil over nothing. But that wasn't quite right, was it? She was sitting vigil over something. I just didn't know what. The next Tuesday, I waited in my office until she arrived, then walked out to introduce myself. I decided to approach her gently, to ask if there was anything I could do to help, any information I could provide about the burial records. She wasn't there. I checked my watch: 2:30 exactly, the time she always came. I walked the entire cemetery, thinking maybe she'd gone to a different plot, but her cream-colored coat was nowhere to be seen. I've been working here for 2 more months now, and she hasn't returned. The white roses she left on her last visit have dried to brown husks, but I haven't had the heart to remove them. They sit on the headstone of Edmund Cross, who may or may not have ever existed, marking a grave that may or may not be empty. Sometimes I wonder if she knew all along, if she was visiting not because someone was buried there, but because someone should have been. There are some graves that teach you things you never wanted to learn, and some devotions that transcend the need for the dead to actually be present. Some sounds follow you long after you've stopped hearing them. I'm Rosa Martinez, and I've been working the night shift at Clearwater Funeral Home for 8 years. Most people assume embalming is grim work, but I've always found it peaceful. There's something honorable about preparing the deceased for their final rest, making sure they look dignified for the families who need to say goodbye. The quiet hours between midnight and dawn give me space to work with care and precision. Our preparation room sits in the basement level, climate-controlled and sterile. White tile floors, stainless steel surfaces, and the soft hum of ventilation systems. During night shifts, I'm usually alone except for the security guard who makes rounds every few hours. The silence doesn't bother me. I've grown comfortable with the company of the dead. Last month, I started hearing footsteps. They began on a Thursday night, while I was working on Mrs. Eleanor Parsons, an elderly woman who'd passed peacefully in her sleep. I'd just finished the arterial injection when I heard someone walking in the hallway outside. Slow, measured steps, like someone moving carefully in the dark. I assumed it was Marcus, our security guard, making his midnight round. But when I checked the hallway, no one was there. Marcus was in the front office, visible through the glass doors, reading his newspaper. The footsteps had stopped. I went back to my work, thinking maybe the building was settling, or the heating system was creating unusual sounds. Old buildings make noise, and Clearwater Funeral Home has been operating since 1938. But as I continued working, I heard them again, the same deliberate footsteps, starting from the far end of the hallway and moving toward the preparation room. This time I opened the door immediately. The hallway was empty, but I could smell something faint in the air. Not unpleasant, exactly, but distinctive, like old roses mixed with something medicinal. The scent lingered for maybe 30 seconds, then faded completely. Over the next few weeks, the footsteps became a regular occurrence, always between 2 and 4 in the morning, always the same slow, careful pace. I started timing them. The walk from the far end of the hallway to the preparation room door took exactly 43 seconds. The footsteps would stop directly outside my door, pause for perhaps 10 seconds, then retreat at the same measured speed. I mentioned it to Marcus during one of his rounds. He listened politely, but couldn't offer any explanation. "Building's old," he said with a shrug. "Could be pipes? Could be the foundation settling. I haven't heard anything unusual. I might have dismissed it as building noise, if not for what I discovered the following Tuesday morning. I'd stayed late to finish preparing Mr. David Chen, a middle-aged man who died in a car accident. The restoration work had been delicate, requiring extra time to ensure he looked peaceful for his family. I'd heard the footsteps twice during the night, once at 2:15, once at 3:30. Both times, they'd followed the same pattern: approach, pause at my door, retreat. When I finished my work around 6 in the morning, I was cleaning my instruments when I noticed something odd. The floor around my workstation looked normal, but near the door, I could see what appeared to be wet footprints on the white tile. Not puddles exactly, but slight dampness in the unmistakable shape of shoe soles. The prints were small, maybe a woman's size 7, with a distinctive wear pattern on the right heel. They started at the doorway and led directly to the preparation table, where Mr. Chen lay, then circled around to the opposite side before returning to the door. The dampness wasn't water. It felt slightly oily, with that same faint medicinal scent I'd noticed before. I took photographs with my phone, then cleaned the area thoroughly. But the next morning, despite my careful cleaning, more prints had appeared. Same size, same pattern, but this time they approached a different preparation table, where I'd been working on an elderly man named Robert Williamson. I decided to review the security footage. Our cameras cover the hallways and entrance areas, but not the preparation room itself. Privacy concerns for the families, Director Hawthorne had explained when the system was installed. But the hallway camera should have captured anyone approaching my work area. Marcus helped me access the recordings from the past week. We fast-forwarded through hours of empty hallways, pausing at each timestamp when I'd heard the footsteps. At 2:15 on Tuesday night, the camera showed me working alone in the preparation room, visible through the small window in the door. The hallway was completely empty. No movement, no shadows, nothing. But at the exact moment I'd heard the footsteps pause outside my door, the camera picked up something unusual. The infrared system detected a temperature differential in the hallway, a vague, human-shaped area of cooler air moving slowly down the corridor. Not solid enough to cast a shadow, but distinct enough for the thermal sensors to register. "Equipment malfunction," Marcus said, but his voice sounded uncertain. "These cameras are getting old. Probably just a calibration issue. Maybe." But that didn't explain what I found the next morning. I'd worked through the night on 2 separate cases: Mrs. Catherine Sullivan and Mr. James Morrison. Both elderly, both natural deaths. I'd heard the footsteps 3 times. Once at 1:45, once at 2:30, and once at 4 to 10. Each time they'd approached my door, paused, and retreated. When I came in the following evening, both bodies had been moved. Not dramatically, the casual observer wouldn't have noticed, but I'm precise about positioning. Mrs. Sullivan's hands had been folded left over right across her chest. Now they were right over left. Mr. Morrison's head had been turned slightly toward the left. Now he faced straight up toward the ceiling. Small changes. Professional changes. As if someone with embalming experience had been working on them after I'd left. I started staying later, working through the dawn hours to see if I could catch whoever was entering my preparation room. I installed a small motion-activated camera near my workstation. Nothing official, just a security device I bought for my own peace of mind. The footsteps continued. Always the same pattern, always the same 43-second approach. But the camera never showed anyone entering the room. It only captured me, working alone with the deceased, pausing occasionally when I heard the sounds in the hallway. But on Thursday morning, reviewing the footage, I noticed something that made my hands shake. At 2:57 a.m., just after I'd heard the footsteps approach and retreat, the camera captured something impossible. For just a few seconds, there appeared to be 2 sets of hands working on the body of Mrs. Helen Garrett. Mine, clearly visible in the frame, completing the final sutures on her dress. And another pair, smaller, more delicate, with painted nails adjusting the positioning of her hands. I watched the footage 17 times. In the dim lighting of the preparation room, with only my work lamp for illumination, it was difficult to be certain. But those additional hands moved with professional skill, making the same careful adjustments I might make myself. I haven't worked a night shift since Thursday. Director Hawthorne was understanding when I requested a transfer to day hours. He said the night work can be demanding, and 8 years was a good run. My replacement is a young man named David, who's eager for the extra pay differential. I haven't told him about the footsteps. Some discoveries feel too personal to share, too strange to put into words. Besides, maybe the sounds will stop now that someone different is working those quiet hours. But sometimes, lying in bed in the early morning darkness, I still hear them. Slow, measured steps approaching my bedroom door, pausing, then retreating into silence. And sometimes I wonder who was helping me all those months, working alongside me in the preparation room, making sure each person was properly cared for before their final rest. Some sounds follow you long after you've stopped hearing them, but not all of them are unwelcome. The guest book remembers everyone who signs it, even those who shouldn't exist. I'm Chen Williams, funeral director at Meadowrest Memorial Home, and I've been helping families through their most difficult moments for 16 years. Part of my job involves managing the practical details that families often overlook in their grief. Things like guest books, flower arrangements, and ensuring the viewing rooms are prepared properly for each service. Our guest books are simple affairs. Leather-bound volumes with cream-colored pages, placed on wooden podiums near the entrance of each viewing room. Families appreciate having a record of who attended the service, and many tell me later that reading through the signatures brings them comfort during the long months of mourning. 3 months ago, I started noticing irregularities in the guest book signatures. It began with the service for Margaret Walsh, an 82-year-old woman who'd taught elementary school for 45 years. Her funeral drew a substantial crowd, former students, teaching colleagues, neighbors from her longtime residence on Oak Street. I'd expected the guest book to be full, and it was. But as I reviewed the signatures later that evening, I found entries that didn't correspond to anyone I'd seen at the service. Eleanor Fitzgerald had signed in neat cursive script, along with a date, September 15th, 1973. Below that, Robert and Mary Hensley, with a date of November 2nd, 1968. Several other signatures bore dates from decades past, written in the same careful penmanship but with different ink colors and pen styles. I assume they were mistakes, perhaps elderly visitors confused about the current date, or family members adding names of deceased relatives who couldn't attend. These things happen more often than you'd expect. Grief can make people do unusual things. But when I mentioned the dated signatures to Margaret Walsh's daughter, she looked puzzled. Eleanor Fitzgerald? That was my mother's best friend from teaching, but she died in 1973. And the Hensleys were our next-door neighbors when I was a child, but they've been gone for years. I let it pass as a coincidence. Family history can be complicated, and maybe someone had wanted to honor the memory of people who'd been important to Margaret during her lifetime. The pattern continued with the next service. Thomas Garrett, a 67-year-old retired mechanic, had a smaller gathering, mostly family, and a few longtime customers from his auto shop. But the guest book contained signatures from people who'd supposedly died decades earlier. William Chen, May 4th, 1959, and Dorothy Mills, August 12th, 1944. When I researched these names out of curiosity, I discovered that William Chen had been a mechanic who'd worked in the same area as Thomas Garrett, but had died in a shop accident in 1959. Dorothy Mills had been a local teacher who died in 1944, long before Thomas would have been old enough to know her. I started keeping detailed records of the unusual signatures, cross-referencing them with local obituary records and historical databases. What I found was unsettling. Every anachronistic signature belonged to someone who had actually lived in our town and died on the dates listed in the guest books. People who couldn't possibly have attended the services because they'd been dead for decades. The signatures appeared to be written by different hands, some shaky with age, others bold and confident, all in ink that looked appropriately faded for the dates listed. But security cameras showed no one approaching the guest book podium except the legitimate mourners I'd observed myself. I decided to monitor one service more carefully. Janet Morrison, a 94-year-old woman who'd been a fixture in the community for 7 decades, was being honored with a large service. I positioned myself where I could watch the guest book throughout the viewing hours, making note of everyone who signed. The service went normally. Dozens of people came to pay their respects, each signing the guest book in the usual way. I watched every signature being written, spoke with most of the attendees personally, and maintained a careful mental count of who had participated. But when I reviewed the book after the service, there were 12 additional signatures I hadn't seen anyone write. All bore dates from between 1935 and 1978. All belonged to people who died decades earlier, but who had some connection to Janet Morrison's long life in the community. Samuel Morton, March 10, 1956, had been Janet's first husband who died in the Korean War. Florence Kennedy, December 2, 1962, had been her sister, who died young of pneumonia. Dr. Harrison Webb, January 18, 1978, had been the physician who delivered Janet's children. Janet's surviving family confirmed these relationships, but insisted none of them could have signed the book. Uncle Samuel died before most of us were born, her grandson told me, and Dr. Webb's been gone for decades. I started filming the guest book podium with a discreet camera during services, trying to capture how these signatures were appearing. The footage showed mourners approaching, signing their names, and leaving. But it also showed something else. At several points during each service, the pages of the guest book would turn themselves, moving backward through previous entries before returning to the current page. During those moments, lasting perhaps 10 to 15 seconds each, additional signatures would appear on the page. Not being written by any visible hand, but materializing letter by letter in real time, as if invisible fingers were holding invisible pens. The handwriting analysis I had done privately confirmed what I'd suspected. Each signature matched historical samples of handwriting from the deceased individuals. Not forgeries or attempts to mimic their writing, but identical matches to letters, documents, and official records from when these people had been alive. Last week, I experienced something that made me reconsider everything I thought I understood about death and remembrance. During the service for Robert Chen, a local businessman, I was standing near the guest book when I heard a soft rustling sound. The pages were turning on their own, moving slowly backward through months of previous entries. As I watched, a signature appeared on the current page. Ellen Chen, beloved wife, April 7, 1941. The letters formed gradually, in blue ink, written by an invisible hand in careful cursive script. Robert Chen's son approached the podium just as the signature finished appearing. Strange, he murmured, reading the fresh entry. Ellen Chen was my grandmother. She died in 1941, just a few months after my father was born. He never got to know her. I looked at the signature, still wet with fresh ink, written by a woman who'd been dead for 83 years. The handwriting was precise and loving, the kind of signature someone might write when visiting a grandchild they'd never had the chance to meet. Now I understand what's happening in our viewing rooms. The guest books don't just record who attends each service. They record who should attend everyone who ever loved the deceased, regardless of whether death has separated them from the living. The signatures are messages, I think, evidence that love transcends the boundaries we assume are permanent, that the dead maintain connections to the living, and return to honor those connections when the opportunity arises. I still manage the guest books carefully, still present them to families as cherished records of their loved ones' services. But now I also read them as something more. Proof that no one is ever truly forgotten, and that some guest lists include names that mortality was never able to erase. The guest book remembers everyone who signs it, even those who shouldn't exist. And sometimes, that includes everyone who should have been there. Some flowers are left by hands that cast no shadows. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I've been the groundskeeper at Riverside Memorial Cemetery for 12 years. It's solitary work that suits my temperament, maintaining the lawns, trimming hedges around headstones, making sure the pathways stay clear for visitors. Most days, I'm alone with the quiet and the steady rhythm of seasonal tasks that keep the grounds looking dignified. Our cemetery has a special section called the Children's Garden, a gated area where families bury children who died without surviving parents or relatives to tend their graves. The section was established in 1962 when the county realized that some of the smallest graves were being neglected, not out of lack of love, but simply because there was no one left to care for them. The Children's Garden is kept locked. Only 3 people have keys: myself, Director Patterson, and Mrs. Eleanor Vance, the volunteer coordinator who organizes memorial services for children with no family. We established this policy to prevent vandalism and ensure that the area remains peaceful and undisturbed. 6 months ago, I started finding fresh flowers inside the locked garden every morning. The first time, I assumed Mrs. Vance had visited the previous evening and forgotten to mention it. A small bouquet of white carnations had been placed on the grave of Timothy Walsh, a 7-year-old boy who died in a house fire in 1989. The flowers were fresh, still damp with morning dew, arranged with the kind of careful attention that suggested personal connection rather than routine maintenance. I called Mrs. Vance to thank her for the thoughtful gesture, but she sounded puzzled. "I haven't been to the Children's Garden in 2 weeks," she told me, "but I'm glad someone is leaving flowers. Those children deserve to be remembered." The next morning brought yellow roses on the grave of Sarah Martinez, an infant who died in 1995. The morning after that, white lilies on the headstone of Michael Chen, a 9-year-old who'd passed away in 2003. Each arrangement was simple but carefully composed, the kind of flowers a loving family member might choose. I mentioned the flowers to Director Patterson during our weekly maintenance meeting. He listened with interest, but didn't seem particularly concerned. "Probably someone who's lost a child themselves," he suggested. "Sometimes people adopt graves when they need somewhere to focus their grief. As long as the flowers are appropriate and the area stays respectful, I don't see any problem." But there was a problem. The Children's Garden was locked, and I was finding flowers inside it every single morning. I started checking the gate more carefully. The lock showed no signs of tampering. The fence around the Children's Garden is 6 feet tall, with pointed iron spikes at the top, difficult to climb without leaving traces of fabric or blood on the metal points. The ground near the fence showed no footprints or disturbed soil that would indicate someone scaling the barrier. Yet the flowers kept appearing, always fresh, always placed with obvious care, always on the graves of children who died alone. Someone was getting inside the locked garden every night and honoring these forgotten children with beautiful arrangements. I decided to arrive earlier and stay later, trying to catch whoever was visiting the Children's Garden. I began my rounds at sunrise instead of 8 in the morning, and I extended my evening maintenance until well after sunset. But no matter how early I arrived, the flowers were already there. And no matter how late I stayed, I never saw anyone approaching the locked gate. One Thursday morning, I found something that made me reconsider everything. On the grave of Amanda Foster, a 6-year-old who died in 2007, someone had left not only flowers, but a small stuffed rabbit. Pink and white, well-loved but carefully maintained, the kind of comfort toy a child might have treasured. Attached to the rabbit was a note in careful handwriting. "For Amanda, from someone who understands. You're not forgotten." The paper was expensive stationery, cream-colored with a subtle floral watermark. The handwriting was feminine, elderly perhaps, with the careful formation that suggested someone who'd learned penmanship in an earlier era. But what struck me most was that the note was completely dry, despite the heavy dew that had covered everything else in the cemetery that morning. I showed the note to Director Patterson, who studied it with growing concern. "This is getting unusual, Marcus. I think we need to figure out who's been coming here. Not because they're doing anything wrong, but because I'd like to understand how they're getting inside a locked area." We decided to install a motion-activated camera pointed at the children's garden gate. Nothing elaborate, just a simple security device that would photograph anyone approaching the area during overnight hours. The camera was positioned to capture both the gate and the interior of the garden, giving us a clear view of anyone entering or leaving. The flowers continued to appear every morning. White roses, yellow daffodils, purple violets, always seasonal, always fresh, always placed with obvious love on the graves of children who died alone. But the camera captured nothing. Night after night of empty footage showing the locked gate and the undisturbed interior of the children's garden. On Tuesday morning, I found something that changed everything. The grave of Jason Bennett, a 10-year-old who died in 1991, had been decorated not just with flowers, but with a collection of small toys, a wooden car, a set of colored pencils, a comic book carefully wrapped in plastic to protect it from weather. The items were arranged in a careful display, as if someone had created a small shrine to childhood itself. But what disturbed me was that I recognized some of the items. The wooden car looked identical to one I'd seen in a photograph on Jason's original grave marker, a snapshot of him playing with his favorite toy, taken just weeks before his death. The comic book was the same issue that had been mentioned in his obituary as his most treasured possession. These weren't random gifts. Someone had researched Jason's life, discovered what he'd loved most, and recreated those precious objects to comfort him in death. I spent that afternoon in the cemetery's administrative office, researching the backgrounds of all the children buried in the locked garden. What I found was a pattern that made my hands shake as I turned through the old files. Every child who'd been receiving flowers and gifts had died alone, not just without surviving family, but literally alone. Timothy Walsh had been trapped by himself in the house fire that killed him. Sarah Martinez had been abandoned at the hospital as an infant and died in the pediatric ward with no visitors. Michael Chen had been in foster care between families when a sudden illness took him. These children had died without anyone holding their hands, without final words of love, without the comfort of knowing they were cherished. And now, decades later, someone was making sure they weren't alone anymore. Yesterday, I decided to spend the entire night in the cemetery, hidden where I could watch the children's garden continuously. I brought a thermos of coffee and a folding chair, and positioned myself behind the maintenance shed where I had a clear view of the locked gate. The night was quiet, filled with the usual sounds of wind through headstones and distant traffic. Around 2 a.m, I saw something that made me question everything I thought I understood about life and death. A figure approached the children's garden gate, an elderly woman in a dark coat, carrying a small basket of flowers. She moved slowly but purposefully, as if the path was familiar to her. When she reached the locked gate, she didn't pause to search for a key or attempt to climb the fence. She simply walked through it, not around it, not over it, through the metal bars as if they weren't there. I watched her move from grave to grave inside the locked garden, placing flowers with obvious love and care, kneeling beside each headstone as if whispering words of comfort to the children buried beneath. When she finished her rounds, she walked back through the locked gate and disappeared into the shadows between the older headstones. I ran to follow her, but when I reached the area where she'd vanished, there was no trace of anyone having passed through. This morning, I found fresh flowers on every grave in the children's garden. White roses, yellow carnations, purple irises, a garden of remembrance for children who died alone but were alone no longer. I don't know who she is or why she's chosen to care for these forgotten children, but I understand now that some kinds of love are stronger than locks, stronger than death itself. Some flowers are left by hands that cast no shadows, and some children, no matter how alone they died, are never truly abandoned. The dead don't always rest as quietly as the living need them to. I'm Elena Rodriguez, and I've been transporting bodies for Henderson Funeral Services for 9 years. It's steady work that requires respect for the deceased and their families, plus the ability to handle the physical and emotional demands of moving people in their final journey from hospital to funeral home to their final resting place. Our funeral home has 4 viewing rooms, numbered 1 through 4, but we also have 3 smaller preparation and holding rooms in the basement level where bodies wait before services or between transport arrangements. Room 7 is the largest of these holding areas, climate-controlled and designed to accommodate multiple caskets when we have several services scheduled close together. 3 months ago, I started noticing that bodies I delivered to Room 7 never stayed in their original positions. The changes were subtle at first. Mrs. Dorothy Henley, an elderly woman who'd passed peacefully at the hospital, had been positioned with her hands folded across her chest and her head resting straight up toward the ceiling. When I returned the next morning to transport her to viewing room 2, her head had turned slightly to the right, toward the door. Not dramatically, maybe 15 degrees, but enough that I noticed immediately. I mentioned it to Janet Mills, our preparation assistant, thinking maybe she'd adjusted Mrs. Henley's positioning as part of the standard preparation process. But Janet looked puzzled. "I haven't worked on anyone in room 7 since Tuesday," she told me, "and I always document any adjustments I make to positioning." I might have dismissed it as a memory error on my part, but the pattern continued. Everybody I delivered to room 7 showed signs of movement by the following day. Always small changes. A head turned toward the door, hands repositioned. Sometimes an entire body shifted slightly to one side of the casket. Never anything dramatic or disturbing, but consistent enough that I started taking photographs to document the original positioning. The photographs confirmed what I'd suspected. Bodies were moving in room 7, changing position in ways that couldn't be explained by normal settling or the effects of the embalming process. The changes seemed purposeful, as if the deceased were adjusting themselves to be more comfortable or to get a better view of something. I brought my concerns to Director Henderson, a man who'd been in the funeral business for 32 years and had seen everything the profession could offer. He listened carefully to my observations, but seemed more curious than alarmed. "Room 7 has always been a little unusual," he admitted. "My father ran this funeral home before me, and he used to say that some rooms just have their own personality. As long as the deceased are treated with respect and the families don't notice anything inappropriate, I don't worry too much about these things." But I was starting to worry. The movements weren't random. Every body placed in room 7 would, within 24 hours, have repositioned itself to face the door, as if they were all waiting for someone to arrive or watching for someone to leave. I decided to spend more time in room 7, ostensibly doing inventory and maintenance work, but actually observing what might be causing these position changes. The room was windowless and quiet, maintained at a steady 68 degrees, with soft fluorescent lighting that never changed intensity. During my extended time in the room, I noticed something else unusual. The deceased in room 7 seemed more present somehow, more aware of their surroundings than bodies in our other holding areas. I can't explain this scientifically, but after 9 years of working with the dead, you develop an intuition about these things. Bodies in rooms 1 through 6 felt like bodies. Bodies in room 7 felt like people who happened to be dead. The sensation was strongest when I was alone with them in the evening, doing final checks before locking up for the night. I would feel eyes on me, a sense of being observed with intelligent attention. When I looked at the deceased directly, they appeared normal, eyes closed, faces peaceful, positioned exactly as I'd left them. But in my peripheral vision, I sometimes caught glimpses of heads turned toward me, eyes that seemed to track my movement around the room. Last month, I experienced something that made me reconsider everything I thought I understood about death and consciousness. I was in room 7 with Mr. Thomas Walsh, a 68-year-old man who died suddenly of a heart attack. I'd positioned him carefully in his casket, hands folded, head straight, preparing him for transport to viewing room 3 the following morning. As I was completing my paperwork, I heard a soft sound, like fabric rustling, or someone shifting position to get more comfortable. When I looked up, Mr. Walsh had turned his head toward me, not slightly, not ambiguously. His face was oriented directly at me, eyes still closed, but unmistakably facing in my direction. I stood perfectly still for several minutes, watching to see if I'd imagined the movement. But Mr. Walsh's head remained turned toward me, positioned in a way that would have been impossible without deliberate adjustment. The change had happened while I was looking down at my clipboard, perhaps 3 feet away from his casket. I approached slowly and gently repositioned his head to face the ceiling, speaking to him softly as I'd been trained to do. "Rest easy, Mr. Walsh. Your family will be here tomorrow to say goodbye." As I adjusted his position, his skin felt normal, cool, but not unnaturally cold, with the slight firmness that comes from proper embalming. But as I stepped back, I could swear I saw the corners of his mouth turn upward slightly, as if he were smiling at some private joke. I started documenting these incidents more systematically, noting not just the position changes, but the apparent personality of each body placed in room 7. What I discovered was that the deceased seemed to retain some awareness of their surroundings and some connection to their living personalities. Mrs. Sarah Chen, a retired teacher who'd been known for her warm demeanor with students, consistently turned toward anyone who entered room 7, as if greeting them. Mr. Robert Martinez, who'd been a mechanic and was described by his family as someone who always wanted to know what was going on, would position himself to have the best view of the room's activities. Most remarkably, children placed in room 7 seemed to arrange themselves as if they were playing or seeking comfort. 8-year-old Emma Foster, who'd died in a car accident, had somehow managed to shift her small form to one side of her child-sized casket, leaving space as if she were making room for an invisible playmate. The behavior wasn't frightening, exactly. It felt more like evidence that consciousness doesn't simply stop at the moment of death, that some awareness persists even after the body can no longer sustain life. The deceased in room 7 seemed to be waiting for something, their families, their services, or perhaps just acknowledgement that they were still, in some sense, present. 2 weeks ago, I had an experience that convinced me that room 7 was different from any other space I'd encountered in 9 years of funeral work. I was preparing to transport 3 bodies, Mrs. Helen Garrett, Mr. David Morrison, and 12-year-old Lucy Walsh, from room 7 to their respective viewing rooms for morning services. When I entered the room, all 3 had positioned themselves to face the door. Not unusual by room 7 standards, but this time they seemed to be arranged almost conversationally, as if they'd been interacting with each other during the night. Mrs. Garrett, who'd been a social person according to her family, was turned slightly toward Mr. Morrison. He, in turn, was oriented toward young Lucy, who had shifted to face both adults. As I began my work, wheeling Mrs. Garrett's casket toward the door, I heard Lucy's voice, not speaking exactly, but a soft humming sound, the kind of gentle melody a child might use to comfort herself when she's scared or lonely. The sound was definitely coming from her casket, soft but unmistakable in the quiet room. I stopped moving and listened carefully. The humming continued for perhaps 30 seconds, a simple tune that sounded like a lullaby. When it stopped, the room fell completely silent again, but I could feel a change in the atmosphere, less tense, more peaceful, as if Lucy had been reassuring the adults that everything would be all right. I completed my transport duties without incident. But as I wheeled Lucy's casket past the others, I whispered, "Thank you for taking care of them." The humming resumed briefly, just long enough to sound like acknowledgement. Now I understand what Director Henderson meant when he said Room 7 had its own personality. It's not the room that's unusual, it's that somehow, in that space, the recently deceased maintain enough awareness to comfort each other, to observe their surroundings, and to prepare themselves for whatever comes next. I still work with bodies in Room 7, but I approach them differently now. I speak to them as I position them, explaining what's happening and when their families will arrive. I make sure they're comfortable and positioned with dignity. And when I leave for the night, I tell them I'll see them in the morning. Because the truth is, I will see them. Not just their bodies, but some essential part of who they were in life, waiting patiently in Room 7 for their final journey to begin. The dead don't always rest as quietly as the living need them to, but sometimes their restlessness comes from a desire to comfort others, to remain connected, and to face whatever comes next with the dignity they maintained in life. Some mourners attend every funeral, whether they belong there or not. I'm Janet Morrison, and I've been the cemetery supervisor at Oakwood Memorial Gardens for 14 years. My job involves coordinating burial services, managing the groundskeeping staff, and ensuring that every funeral proceeds with the dignity and respect that grieving families deserve. In 14 years, I've overseen more than 3,000 services, and I've learned to recognize the patterns of human grief, the ways people say goodbye, the rituals that bring them comfort, the faces that appear again and again in our small community. That's why I noticed her immediately. The woman in the blue coat who attends every funeral. She appeared first at the service for Margaret Walsh in late March, a memorial for an 80-year-old retired librarian who'd been beloved in our town. The woman stood at the back of the gathered crowd, wearing a navy blue wool coat despite the warm spring weather. She was perhaps 60 years old, with gray hair pulled back in a simple bun and an expression of profound sadness that seemed both personal and universal. I assumed she was a friend of the family or a library patron who'd been touched by Mrs. Walsh's kindness. Many people in small towns form connections that aren't immediately obvious to outsiders. The woman stayed through the entire service, watching with respectful attention as Mrs. Walsh was laid to rest, then left quietly without speaking to anyone. 3 days later, she appeared at the funeral of Robert Chen, a 42-year-old mechanic who died suddenly of a heart attack. Again, she wore the same blue coat, stood at the back of the crowd, and observed the service with the same expression of deep, personal sorrow. This time, I paid closer attention to her behavior. She never approached the family, never signed the guest book, never participated in the traditional elements of funeral attendance. She simply watched, grieved, and departed. Over the following weeks, I began looking for her at every service. She was always there, always in the blue coat, always positioned where she could observe without intruding, always wearing that expression of profound loss. She attended the funeral of 94-year-old Eleanor Fitzgerald, 8-year-old Tommy Martinez, who died in a playground accident, 37-year-old Sarah Johnson, who'd lost her battle with cancer. Services for people who couldn't possibly have known each other, from different generations and social circles, yet she mourned them all with equal intensity. I started keeping notes about her attendance, documenting her behavior, and trying to understand her connection to our community. She arrived at every service exactly 15 minutes before the scheduled start time. She positioned herself in the same spot, relative to the gathered mourners, close enough to hear, but far enough away to avoid drawing attention. She never carried flowers, never brought offerings, never showed any sign of personal relationship with the deceased. Most unusually, she never seemed to age. After 6 months of regular sightings, she looked exactly the same as when I'd first noticed her. Same coat, same posture, same carefully arranged gray hair. In a town where I knew most residents by sight, Her unchanging appearance began to seem uncanny. I decided to research the cemetery's historical records, thinking perhaps she was a longtime resident whose family had deep roots in Oakwood Memorial Gardens. Our files go back to 1928 when the cemetery was established, and they include photographs from many of the larger services over the decades. What I found made me question everything I thought I understood about the woman in the blue coat. In a photograph from 1987, taken at the funeral of a prominent local businessman, I spotted a familiar figure in the background. A woman in a blue coat, standing at the edge of the crowd, wearing the same expression of profound sorrow I'd been observing for months. The photograph was 35 years old, but the woman looked identical to the person I'd been seeing at recent funerals. I found her in more photographs. A 1992 service for a teenage car accident victim, a 1998 funeral for an elderly farmer, a 2004 memorial for a young mother who died of complications during childbirth. In every image, she appeared exactly the same. Same age, same coat, same position relative to the mourners, same expression of universal grief. 35 years of photographs, and she hadn't aged a single day. I shared my findings with Director Harrison, who'd been running the funeral home since 1973. He studied the photographs with growing recognition and an expression I'd never seen on his face before, something between wonder and unease. "I remember her," he said slowly. "I've been seeing her at funerals for decades, but I never really thought about it. You know how it is, there are always people at services who blend into the background. But now that you mention it, she has been remarkably consistent." We decided to review our security footage more systematically. Oakwood Memorial Gardens had installed cameras in 2010, and we had digital records of every service since then. Director Harrison and I spent an afternoon reviewing recordings from dozens of funerals, looking for the woman in the blue coat. She appeared in every single recording, always in the same position, always with the same demeanor, always departing at the same point in each service, immediately after the final prayer, but before the family's private moment at the graveside. But the footage revealed something else unusual. She never arrived by car, never approached from the parking area, and never left through any of the cemetery's established entrances. She simply appeared among the mourners and disappeared when the service concluded, as if she materialized from the landscape itself. Last month, I decided to approach her directly. During the funeral of David Martinez, a 60-year-old postal worker, I positioned myself near her usual spot and waited for her to arrive. When she appeared exactly 15 minutes before the service, as always, I walked over and introduced myself. "Excuse me," I said gently. "I'm Janet Morrison, the cemetery supervisor. I've noticed you attend many of our services, and I wanted to make sure you have everything you need." She turned to look at me, and I saw her eyes for the first time. They were gray, filled with a sadness so deep it seemed to encompass every loss that had ever occurred in the world. When she spoke, her voice was soft but clear, with an accent I couldn't quite place. Not local, but not obviously foreign either. "I come to witness," she said simply. "Everyone deserves to be mourned properly. Sometimes families are too small or too overwhelmed by grief to provide all the sorrow that death requires. I help carry the weight." Before I could ask any follow-up questions, she smiled a gentle expression that transformed her entire face and walked away. I tried to follow her, but within moments, she had vanished among the headstones, leaving no trace of her passage. That evening, I researched the concept of professional mourners, thinking perhaps she was continuing some ancient tradition of hired grief. What I learned was that many cultures throughout history have employed mourners to ensure that deaths are properly honored, that the deceased receive adequate lamentation to ease their passage to whatever comes next. But professional mourners are typically paid by families, hired for specific services. This woman attended every funeral in our cemetery, regardless of whether the families needed additional mourning. She came because death itself required witnessing, because every ending deserved acknowledgement, because grief shared is grief made bearable. This week, I experienced something that convinced me the woman in the blue coat is something more than human, something essential to the process of death and remembrance. During the funeral of infant Emma Chen, who'd lived only 3 days, the gathered crowd was small, and the grief was overwhelming. The baby's parents were devastated, supported by a handful of relatives who struggled to provide comfort in the face of such senseless loss. The woman in the blue coat stood in her usual position, but this time her expression had intensified beyond simple sorrow. Tears streamed down her face as she witnessed the burial of someone who'd barely had time to live. And as I watched, other mourners began to calm, as if her profound grief was somehow absorbing and transforming their own pain into something more manageable. When the service concluded, baby Emma's mother approached the woman in the blue coat. "Thank you for being here," she whispered. "I don't know who you are, but thank you for crying with us." The woman nodded, reached into her coat pocket, and placed something in the mother's hands, a small white stone, smooth and warm, like something that had been held close to someone's heart for a very long time. "She was loved," the woman said. "Brief life, but completely loved. That matters more than duration." Later, when I asked Emma's mother about the encounter, she told me the woman had simply vanished. I looked away for just a moment to thank the minister, and when I turned back, she was gone. But this stone. She showed me the white stone, which seemed to glow with its own inner light. It's still warm, and when I hold it, I feel like Emma is still with us somehow. I understand now that the woman in the blue coat isn't just attending our funerals. She's facilitating them, ensuring that every death receives the full measure of grief it deserves, carrying sorrow so that families don't have to bear the entire weight alone. She's been doing this for at least 35 years, probably longer, serving as a bridge between the living and the dead. Some mourners attend every funeral, whether they belong there or not. But sometimes, not belonging there is exactly what makes their presence necessary. The dead remember your name long after you've forgotten theirs. I'm Dale Peterson, and I've been working the night shift as a mortician at Riverside Funeral Home for 11 years. Night work suits me. There's something peaceful about the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, when the world slows down and I can focus on the careful, respectful work of preparing the deceased for their final rest. The building is mine during those hours, shared only with the gentle hum of refrigeration units and the soft sounds of a business settling into sleep. Our intercom system was installed in 1985, a basic setup that allows communication between the preparation areas, the main office, and the director's residence upstairs. It's primarily used during business hours for coordinating services and managing the practical details of funeral operations. During night shifts, the system stays silent except for the occasional crackle of static from the aging electronics. 6 months ago, the intercom started calling my name. The first time, I assumed it was Director Marshall checking on something from his upstairs apartment. The voice came through the speaker in the main preparation room, where I was working on Mrs. Dorothy Walsh, an elderly woman who'd passed peacefully in her sleep. A soft voice, almost whisper quiet, saying "Dale," with a questioning inflection, as if someone was trying to get my attention. I pressed the response button and called back, "Yes, Mr. Marshall, what do you need?" But there was no answer. When I finished my work and checked upstairs, I found Director Marshall sound asleep, and he confirmed the next morning that he hadn't used the intercom during the night. I might have dismissed it as equipment malfunction, but the voice calling my name became a regular occurrence. Always late at night, always when I was alone in the preparation areas, always the same soft, questioning tone. Sometimes it happened once during a shift, sometimes 3 or 4 times. The voice was never urgent or frightening, just persistent, as if someone was trying to get my attention for something important. After a few weeks, I started paying closer attention to the voice itself. It wasn't the same person calling each time. Sometimes it sounded like an elderly woman, sometimes a younger man, occasionally a child. The tones were different, the inflections varied, but they all spoke my name with the same gentle familiarity, as if they knew me personally. I mentioned the intercom issue to Director Marshall, thinking it might be electrical interference or equipment aging. He had a technician check the system, but the inspection revealed no mechanical problems. The wiring was sound. The speakers functioned normally, and there was no external interference that could account for voices coming through the system. Probably just picking up radio signals, the technician suggested. These old intercoms sometimes catch transmissions from emergency services or taxi companies. Nothing to worry about. But radio signals don't call people by name with such personal familiarity. I started keeping notes about when the voices occurred, trying to find patterns that might explain their origin. What I discovered was unsettling. The voices always seemed to correspond with the people I'd been working on. The night I heard an elderly woman's voice calling my name was the same night I was preparing Mrs. Helen Foster for her service. The young man's voice occurred while I was working on 28-year-old Robert Chen, who died in a motorcycle accident. The connection became undeniable when I heard 8-year-old Lucy Martinez call my name on the night I was preparing her small form for a funeral that would break her family's hearts. Her voice through the intercom was exactly what you'd expect from a child, higher pitched, with a slight lisp on the sound that her mother later confirmed was characteristic of Lucy's speech. I began responding to the voices, speaking into the intercom as if I were having actual conversations with the deceased. It felt natural, somehow like the kind of gentle communication I'd been trained to maintain while working. "Yes, Mrs. Foster, I'm here," I would say. "I'm taking good care of you for tomorrow's service." The voices would continue after my responses, but not in words. Instead, I would hear soft sounds, sighs of relief, gentle humming, occasionally what sounded like whispered, "Thank you." Once, after preparing a young father who died in a construction accident, I heard what I was certain was quiet crying through the intercom, the sound of someone grieving for the family he'd left behind. 3 months ago, I had an experience that convinced me the voices were coming from the people I was preparing, not from some external source. I was working on Mr. Thomas Morrison, a 72-year-old retired teacher who'd been known throughout the community for his kindness to students. His family had told me stories about his dedication, his patience with difficult children, his ability to make every student feel valued and heard. As I worked, Mr. Morrison's voice came through the intercom with unusual clarity. "Dale," he said, and then continued, "Thank you for being gentle with me. I can feel your care, and it means more than you know. I have something I need to tell you." I stopped my work and listened carefully. Mr. Morrison's voice continued through the speaker, warm and familiar despite the electronic distortion. "In my desk at the school, there's a letter I never sent. Bottom drawer, under the grade books. It's for my daughter Sarah. Could you make sure she gets it? She needs to know how proud I am of the woman she became." The next morning, I called Riverside Elementary School and spoke with the principal about Mr. Morrison's classroom. With the family's permission, we searched his desk and found exactly what he'd described. A handwritten letter addressed to his daughter Sarah, expressing love and pride that he'd apparently been too reserved to share while alive. When I gave the letter to Sarah Morrison at her father's funeral, she broke down in tears. "This is exactly what I needed to hear," she told me. "I've been wondering my whole life if he was proud of me. How did you know to look for this?" I told her that sometimes the deceased find ways to communicate important messages, that love transcends the boundaries we assume are permanent. She nodded, as if this explanation made perfect sense to her. Since then, I've been listening more carefully to the voices that call my name through the intercom. They're not just seeking attention, they're trying to communicate final messages, unfinished business, expressions of love that they never had the chance to share while alive. Last week, Mrs. Catherine Bell's voice came through the intercom with urgent clarity. Dale. Tell my grandson Michael that the recipe for my Christmas cookies is written inside my copy of Joy of Cooking, page 237. He always said he wanted to learn to make them. 2 nights ago, young David Foster spoke to me about a hidden savings account he'd never told his wife about. The money is in First National Bank, account number written in my toolbox under the small screwdriver set. Tell Maria it's for the kids' college funds. I wanted it to be a surprise. Each message has proven accurate when I've passed them along to families. Hidden savings accounts exist where the deceased said they would. Important documents are found in the exact locations described. Final words of love reach their intended recipients through voices that speak through an intercom system that should only carry the communications of the living. I understand now that my role extends beyond preparing bodies for burial. I'm also facilitating final communications, serving as a bridge between the dead and the living they're not ready to leave behind. The intercom has become a channel for love that death couldn't silence, for practical concerns that transcend mortality, for final words that comfort families in their darkest hours. Tonight, I'm working alone with Mr. Richard Walsh, a 65-year-old grandfather who died suddenly while playing with his grandchildren. I expect his voice to call my name before dawn, and I'll be ready to listen. Because sometimes the most important conversations happen after the speakers have officially stopped speaking. The dead remember your name long after you've forgotten theirs. And sometimes they use that memory to make sure love finds its way home. Some stones turn to watch the living, especially those who shouldn't be living at all. My name is Tommy Rodriguez, and I've been a gravedigger at Willowbrook Cemetery for 7 years. It's honest work that requires physical strength, attention to detail, and a respect for the permanent nature of what we're creating. When you dig a grave, you're preparing someone's final resting place, and that responsibility weighs on you in ways that people outside the business don't always understand. Willowbrook has been operating since 1932, and some sections of the cemetery show their age. The older headstones have shifted slightly over the decades due to ground settling, weather exposure, and the natural processes that affect anything left outdoors for extended periods. This kind of gradual movement is normal, expected even, and part of my job involves monitoring the headstones for stability and safety. 4 months ago, I started noticing headstones that moved more than they should. The first time was in Section C, where we bury people who died in accidents or under violent circumstances. I'd been doing routine maintenance, clearing weeds and checking the stability of markers, when I noticed that the headstone for Marcus Webb had shifted position overnight. Marcus had died in a car accident in 1998, and his granite marker had been facing due east toward the rising sun, the standard orientation for most burials. But when I arrived for work on Tuesday morning, Marcus Webb's headstone was facing northeast, turned approximately 30 degrees from its original position. The stone was heavy, probably 400 pounds of solid granite set in a concrete foundation. It shouldn't have been able to move at all, let alone rotate to face a completely different direction. I assumed vandalism or some kind of mechanical disturbance, maybe heavy equipment from road construction affecting the ground stability. I used a small crane to reposition the headstone to its original orientation, making sure the foundation was secure and level. But the next morning, it had turned again, this time facing northwest toward the residential area of town. Over the following weeks, I discovered that several headstones in Section C were rotating during the night. Always markers for people who died. Violently car accidents, workplace incidents, domestic violence, criminal acts, and always turning to face specific directions that seemed purposeful rather than random. I started documenting the rotations with photographs, taking pictures of each headstone's position at the end of each workday and again when I arrived the next morning. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. The turned headstones were all facing toward the homes of people who were still alive, people who had some connection to the violent deaths buried beneath the stones. Marcus Webb's headstone faced the house where his ex-girlfriend lived. the woman he'd been arguing with on the phone when he crashed his car. Sarah Martinez's marker turned toward the apartment complex where her abusive ex-husband had moved after being released from prison. David Chen's stone faced the office building where his former business partner worked, the man who'd been suspected but never charged in David's suspicious death. The headstones were turning to watch the living, specifically those who might bear responsibility for the deaths they marked. I brought my documentation to Cemetery Director Patterson, a man who'd been managing Willowbrook for 23 years. He examined my photographs with growing concern, studying the precise measurements I'd taken to track each rotation. "This is highly unusual, Tommy," he admitted. "Headstones this size don't move on their own, and the precision of the rotations suggests something more than ground settling or weather effects. Have you noticed any other disturbances in the cemetery? Vandalism, unusual activity, anything that might explain these movements?" I told him about the other strange occurrences I'd observed in Section C. Fresh flowers appearing on graves with no recent visitors. Handwritten notes left on headstones, written in what appeared to be the handwriting of the deceased themselves. Sounds of digging in the middle of the night, coming from graves that had been undisturbed for decades. Director Patterson decided to install motion-activated cameras in Section C, focused on the headstones that had been rotating. The cameras were equipped with infrared sensors and night vision capabilities, designed to capture any activity that might explain the movements. The footage revealed something that neither of us was prepared to see. The cameras showed the headstones rotating on their own, turning slowly but steadily during the darkest hours of the night. No visible force was moving them. No people, no equipment, no external interference. The massive granite markers simply rotated on their foundations, as if they were mounted on invisible bearings, turning until they faced the precise directions that seemed to correspond with their targets. But more disturbing than the movements themselves was what the infrared cameras detected. As each headstone rotated, the thermal imaging showed heat signatures rising from the graves beneath, not the heat of decay or natural decomposition, but organized patterns that suggested activity, purpose, consciousness. The dead were turning their markers to face the living, and they were doing it with deliberate intent. I decided to research the specific people whose graves were rotating, learning more about their deaths and the circumstances that surrounded them. What I discovered was that none of these deaths had been properly resolved. Marcus Webb's car accident was officially ruled driver error, but witnesses reported seeing another vehicle that might have forced him off the road. Sarah Martinez had died in what was ruled a domestic violence incident, but her killer had received a reduced sentence and was released after serving only 3 years. David Chen's death was officially accidental, but evidence suggested workplace sabotage that had never been prosecuted. These were people who died violently and unjustly, whose deaths had not received adequate justice or resolution. And now their headstones were turning to watch the people who might bear responsibility for their deaths, or who might be in danger of becoming their next victims. Last month, I witnessed something that convinced me the rotating headstones were more than just supernatural phenomena. They were warnings. I was working late in Section C, repairing a damaged drainage system, when I noticed that 3 headstones had turned to face the same direction. Marcus Webb, Sarah Martinez, and David Chen, 3 people who died under suspicious circumstances, all had their markers pointing toward the same residential address on Maple Street. The next morning, I researched the address and discovered it belonged to Detective James Morrison, a police officer who'd been involved in investigating all 3 deaths. Detective Morrison had been the one who'd ruled Marcus Webb's crash as driver error, who'd accepted the domestic violence explanation for Sarah Martinez's death, who'd closed David Chen's case as accidental. That afternoon, Detective Morrison was killed in what appeared to be a random mugging downtown. But when the investigation was completed, evidence emerged, suggesting that Morrison had been taking bribes to cover up evidence in several cases, including the 3 deaths marked by the rotating headstones. The headstones had been pointing towards someone who deserved to be watched. Someone whose own actions had made him a target for the kind of justice that transcends legal systems. Now I understand what's happening in Section C. The dead who died violently and unjustly aren't resting peacefully because their deaths haven't been properly resolved. Their headstones turn to watch the living, sometimes as warnings, sometimes as accusations, sometimes as promises that justice delayed is not justice denied. I still maintain the cemetery, still ensure that all the headstones are properly positioned and secure, but I no longer try to prevent the rotations in Section C. Some stones need to turn to watch the living, especially those who shouldn't be living at all. Some stones turn to watch the living, especially those who shouldn't be living at all. And sometimes that watching is the first step toward a justice that courts and juries couldn't provide. Some rooms host services for people who were never meant to be buried at all. I'm Mills Davidson, Assistant Director at Harmony Funeral Home, and I've been coordinating memorial services for 8 years. My job involves scheduling viewing rooms, managing family requests, and ensuring that every detail of each service reflects the love and respect that the deceased deserves. It's work that requires organization, compassion, and attention to the small things that can make an enormous difference during a family's darkest hours. We have 4 viewing rooms at Harmony Funeral Home, numbered 1 through 4 for simple organizational purposes. Rooms 1, 2, and 4 get regular use and require constant attention. Fresh flowers, clean carpets, properly arranged seating, and all the details that create a peaceful environment for grief and remembrance. Room 3 has always been different. Room 3 shows signs of use even when no services are scheduled. The first time I noticed something unusual was 3 months ago, on a Wednesday morning when I was preparing for the week's services. According to my scheduling records, Room 3 was empty. No viewings booked, no family meetings planned, no reason for anyone to have been using the space. But when I unlocked the door to do my routine maintenance check, the room looked like it had hosted a service the night before. The chairs were arranged in perfect rows facing the front of the room. Fresh tissue boxes had been placed on the side tables, still sealed but positioned exactly where grief-stricken family members would need them. The guest book podium had been moved from its storage position to the entrance area, open to a blank page with a pen placed carefully beside it. Most puzzling, the room felt warm, with recent human presence, the way spaces feel when they've been occupied by people experiencing strong emotions. The air held a faint scent of flowers, though no arrangements were visible, and the carpet showed the subtle impressions of feet that had gathered, stood, and departed. I checked with my colleagues to see if anyone had used Room 3 for an unscheduled meeting or private service, but everyone confirmed that the room had been locked and unused. Director Kingsfield reviewed the security footage, but the cameras showed no one entering or leaving Room 3 during the overnight hours. Probably just building maintenance, he suggested. Maybe the cleaning crew moved things around and forgot to mention it. But our cleaning service works during business hours and follows specific protocols that don't include rearranging furniture or setting up for services. The pattern continued over the following weeks. Every few days, I would arrive to find Room 3, arranged for a memorial service that had never been scheduled. The setup was always perfect chairs positioned for optimal viewing, lighting adjusted to create the right atmosphere, even small details like water glasses placed discreetly for family members who might need them during emotional moments. More disturbing was the guest book. Despite Room 3 hosting no official services, the guest book consistently contained signatures written in languages I didn't recognize. Not foreign languages exactly, but scripts that seemed older, more ornate, with letter formations that didn't correspond to any alphabet I'd encountered. The signatures were written in different inks and pen styles, suggesting multiple visitors, but security footage never showed anyone entering the room. I started documenting these occurrences systematically, photographing the room setup and the guest book entries each time I discovered them. What emerged was evidence of regular memorial services being held in Room 3 for people who apparently didn't exist in any official records. The guest book signatures, when I researched them with the help of a linguistics professor at the local college, appeared to be names written in scripts that predated modern record keeping. Professor Chen, who specialized in historical writing systems, examined my photographs with growing fascination. These appear to be personal names written in various archaic scripts, she told me. Some resemble medieval Latin, others look like ancient Germanic runes, still others appear to be variations of early Slavic writing. But what's unusual is that they're all written as if by people who were native speakers of these languages, not modern attempts to copy historical scripts. She paused, studying one particular signature more closely. This one is especially interesting. It's written in a style of Latin that was only used in certain regions of Italy during the 13th century. Whoever wrote this would have to be either a scholar specializing in that exact period and location, or someone who actually lived during that time. I started staying late at the funeral home, hoping to catch whoever was using Room 3 for these mysterious services. On Tuesday night, I positioned myself in the adjacent office where I could monitor the room through a small window while appearing to work on scheduling and administrative tasks. Around midnight, I heard sounds from Room 3, soft murmuring, the rustle of clothing, the gentle movement of people settling into chairs. The sounds were unmistakable, a gathering of mourners attending a memorial service. But when I looked through the window, the room appeared empty. The sounds continued for approximately an hour. I could hear someone speaking at the front of the room in what sounded like a eulogy, though the words were too muffled to understand clearly. There were moments of silence that felt like prayer, soft sounds that might have been crying, and the subtle movements of people rising and sitting during different portions of a service. When the sounds stopped, I waited 20 minutes before entering Room 3. The room was arranged exactly as I'd found it on previous mornings, chairs in perfect rows, fresh tissues, guest book opened to a new page with additional signatures in archaic scripts. The air was warm with recent presents, and I could smell the faint scent of unfamiliar flowers mixed with something like old incense. But what convinced me that something truly supernatural was happening in Room 3 was what I found written in the guest book that night. Among the usual archaic signatures was one entry in modern English. "Thank you for allowing us to honor our dead properly. We have been waiting so long for a place to gather, to remember, to say goodbye as our traditions require." The signature was dated with that night's date, written in ink that was still wet when I discovered it. I decided to research the history of the land where Harmony Funeral Home was built, thinking perhaps we were dealing with some kind of historical memory, spirits of people who died in the area during earlier periods. What I discovered was that our building sits on ground that had been used for burial purposes since the early 1800s. Before Harmony Funeral Home was established in 1958, the site had been home to several different burial grounds, serving various immigrant communities who'd settled in the area during the 19th century. German immigrants, Eastern European families, Italian communities, all had used portions of this land to bury their dead according to their own cultural traditions. When the modern funeral home was built, the remains were supposed to have been relocated to Oakwood Cemetery across town. But historical records were incomplete, and it was likely that some burials had been overlooked during the relocation process. Room 3, I realized, was built directly over what had once been the center of these historical burial grounds, and the mysterious services being held there were memorial gatherings for people who'd been buried on that land decades or centuries earlier, whose graves had been forgotten, but whose spirits still gathered to honor their own traditions of remembrance. Last week, I decided to stop fighting what was happening in Room 3. Instead of constantly rearranging the furniture and clearing the guest book, I began leaving the room set up for services and providing fresh supplies when needed. I placed flowers in the room's simple arrangements that seemed appropriate for solemn gatherings. I made sure the guest book always had clean pages and working pens. The mysterious services continued, but with a different quality. The sounds from room 3 became more peaceful, less restless. The guest book signatures, while still in archaic scripts, began to include brief messages in broken English. Gratitude for respect shown, peace for the forgotten, rest for those who waited long. Director Kingsfield noticed the changes in my approach and asked about my new policy regarding room 3. I explained what I'd discovered and my decision to accommodate rather than resist the supernatural services. He listened thoughtfully, then nodded. Maybe that's the right approach. We're in the business of helping people honor their dead and find peace in loss. If some of those people happen to have been dead themselves for a century or two, well, that doesn't change our fundamental mission. Now room 3 operates as both a conventional viewing room for scheduled services and an ongoing memorial space for the forgotten dead who once rested beneath our building. The two purposes don't conflict. The historical spirits seem to use the room only during overnight hours, leaving it ready for living families during business hours. Sometimes I find small offerings left in room 3, old coins, dried flowers, handmade items that look like they belong to earlier centuries. I treat these with the same respect I show to flowers and mementos left by contemporary families, understanding them as expressions of love that transcend the boundaries of time and mortality. Some rooms host services for people who were never meant to be buried at all. But room 3 has taught me that being forgotten is not the same as being gone, and that some gatherings of mourners include both the living and the dead, united in their need to remember, to honor, and to find peace in the enduring power of love. Some monuments appear for deaths that haven't officially happened yet. I'm Pete Garrison, and I've been the landscaper at Riverside Memorial Gardens for 9 years. My work involves maintaining the Memorial Garden, a peaceful section of the cemetery where families can place small stone markers, memorial benches, and remembrance plaques for loved ones whose bodies were buried elsewhere or lost to circumstances that made traditional burial impossible. The Memorial Garden serves families who need a place to visit and remember, even when they don't have a traditional gravesite. Victims of accidents whose bodies were never recovered, soldiers missing in action, people who donated their bodies to science, all have memorial markers in our garden, where families can come to feel connected to their departed loved ones. Part of my job involves installing new memorial stones and plaques when families purchase them through our office. Each installation requires careful planning, proper foundation work, and coordination with Director Walsh to ensure that every marker is positioned appropriately and maintained with dignity. It's precise work that demands attention to detail and respect for the permanent nature of what we're creating. 3 months ago, I started finding memorial stones that I hadn't installed. The first appeared on a Tuesday morning in the northeast corner of the Memorial Garden. A simple granite marker, approximately 12 inches square, engraved with Eleanor Martinez, beloved mother, 1942 to 2024. The stone was professionally carved and properly installed, with the kind of foundation work that suggested experienced craftsmanship. But I had no record of installing a memorial for Eleanor Martinez, and our office had no paperwork indicating that any family had purchased a marker for someone by that name. The stone appeared overnight, positioned exactly where it belonged among the other memorial markers, as if it had always been part of the garden. I assumed there had been some administrative error, perhaps a miscommunication between our office staff and the monument company. These things happen occasionally. Paperwork gets misfiled. Installation schedules get confused. Families make arrangements through different representatives. I made a note to check with Director Walsh about the Eleanor Martinez Memorial and continued with my regular maintenance work. But when I researched Eleanor Martinez, I discovered something disturbing. According to public records, Eleanor Martinez was still alive. She was 82 years old, living in a nursing home across town, with no indication that she was terminally ill or in any immediate danger. The death date carved into her memorial stone was still 6 months in the future. I brought this discovery to Director Walsh, who was equally puzzled by the appearance of a memorial stone for someone who was still living. We decided to contact Eleanor Martinez's family to see if they had somehow arranged for a memorial marker in advance, perhaps as part of pre-planning for her eventual death. Eleanor's daughter, Carmen Martinez, was shocked to learn about the memorial stone. "We haven't made any arrangements for my mother," she told us. "She's in good health for her age, and we certainly wouldn't order a memorial stone with a specific death date. That's morbid and inappropriate." Director Walsh and I examined the stone more carefully, looking for any indication of who might have had it carved and installed. The craftsmanship was professional, identical to work done by our regular monument company, but when we contacted them, they had no record of producing a memorial for Eleanor Martinez. We decided to leave the stone in place while we investigated further, thinking that solving this mystery might prevent similar incidents in the future. But the next week brought another unexplained memorial. Robert Chen, devoted father, 1955 to 2024, with a death date 3 months in the future. Robert Chen was also still alive, a 69-year-old retired mechanic who'd been in perfect health at his last medical checkup 2 weeks earlier. His family had no knowledge of any memorial arrangements and was deeply disturbed by the appearance of a marker predicting his death. Over the following month, 5 more memorial stones appeared overnight in the memorial garden, all for people who were still living, all with death dates in the near future, all installed with professional precision by someone who left no trace of their identity or methods. I started monitoring the memorial garden more carefully, checking each evening before I left and again when I arrived the next morning. But the stones continued to appear despite my increased attention. Whoever was installing them worked quickly and quietly, completing foundation work and stone placement without disturbing the surrounding area or leaving any evidence of their activity. The pattern that emerged was troubling. Every person memorialized by these mysterious stones died exactly on the date carved into their markers. Eleanor Martinez passed away peacefully in her sleep on the predicted date. Robert Chen suffered a fatal heart attack on the morning specified by his memorial stone. One by one, the predictions carved in granite proved to be accurate. What made this even more disturbing was that all the deaths appeared to be natural. No violence, no accidents, no suspicious circumstances that would suggest someone was deliberately causing these deaths to match the memorial dates. The people simply died when the stones said they would, as if the markers were somehow predicting rather than causing their deaths. I began researching each person who received a mysterious memorial stone, trying to understand what connected them. What I discovered was that all of them had one thing in common: they were alone. Eleanor Martinez had outlived her husband and had only one daughter who lived several states away. Robert Chen was a widower, whose children visited infrequently. The others were equally isolated elderly people, whose social connections had diminished over time, leaving them with minimal family contact and few close relationships. These were people who might die alone, whose deaths might go unnoticed for days or weeks, who had no one maintaining regular contact to ensure their well-being. The memorial stones seemed to be appearing for people who needed to be remembered, whose deaths required witnessing even if they had no one left to witness them. Last month, I experienced something that convinced me the memorial stones were not predictions, but preparations, evidence that someone or something was ensuring that these isolated deaths would be properly acknowledged and mourned. I was working late in the memorial garden, installing a legitimate memorial stone for the Peterson family, when I noticed a figure moving among the existing markers, an elderly man in work clothes, carrying what appeared to be stone-cutting tools, moving slowly between the memorial stones as if reading each inscription carefully. I approached him, thinking he might be a family member visiting the garden, but as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The man appeared to be semi-transparent, visible but not quite solid, like someone seen through heavy fog or dim lighting. He was kneeling beside a blank space in the memorial garden, working with tools that made no sound despite appearing to cut through stone. I called out to him, but he didn't respond to my voice. I moved closer, trying to get a better look at what he was doing, and saw that he was carving a memorial stone that hadn't been there moments earlier. The inscription was taking shape under his silent tools. Margaret Walsh, loving grandmother, 1938 to 2024. As I watched, he completed the engraving, set the stone carefully in place with the kind of precision that comes from decades of experience, then gathered his tools and walked away. Within moments, he had vanished completely, leaving behind a professionally installed memorial stone for someone who was presumably still alive. The next morning, I learned that Margaret Walsh had indeed died during the night peacefully at home, discovered by a neighbor who'd come to check on her after noticing that her usual morning routine had been disrupted. She had been exactly the kind of person the mysterious memorial stones seemed to honor. Elderly, isolated, with minimal family connections, but deserving of remembrance and respect. I understand now that the memorial stones are not predictions, but preparations, created by someone who ensures that every death receives proper acknowledgement, especially those deaths that might otherwise go unnoticed. The elderly craftsman I witnessed appears to be working on behalf of people who would die alone, making sure their passing is marked with dignity and their lives remembered with appropriate memorial markers. I've stopped trying to prevent the appearance of these memorial stones. Instead, I maintain them with the same care I give to all the markers in the memorial garden, understanding them as evidence that some deaths receive attention from sources beyond the living world. When families discover that memorial stones have appeared for their deceased relatives, I explain that the cemetery has a tradition of honoring people who might otherwise be forgotten, that some monuments are placed by anonymous benefactors who believe every life deserves remembrance. It's a truthful explanation, even if it doesn't include all the supernatural details. Some monuments appear for deaths that haven't officially happened yet. But I've learned that these stones aren't predicting death, they're ensuring that when death comes, especially to those who might die alone, it will be met with the dignity, respect, and remembrance that every human life deserves. Some passengers sing lullabies to comfort themselves on their final journey. I'm Carmen Phillips, and I've been driving a hearse for Meadowbrook Funeral Services for 6 years. It's work that requires a steady hand, respectful demeanor, and understanding that you're providing the final transportation for people who've completed their earthly journey. Every trip is someone's last ride, and that responsibility weighs on you in ways that make you drive more carefully, speak more softly, and treat every mile as sacred ground. The route between Mercy General Hospital and our funeral home covers 12 miles of suburban roads, a journey I've made hundreds of times with passengers who'll never see the landscape again. I've learned to drive these trips with particular gentleness, avoiding sudden stops or sharp turns, maintaining a pace that feels dignified and peaceful. It's a small gesture of respect, but it matters to the families and to me. 4 months ago, I started hearing soft humming from the back of the hearse during certain transports. The first time was while transporting Mrs. Helen Foster, an 87-year-old woman who'd passed peacefully surrounded by her family. About halfway through the journey, I became aware of a gentle sound coming from the rear compartment, a soft, melodic humming that sounded like someone trying to comfort themselves with a familiar tune. The melody was simple and soothing, the kind of lullaby an elderly person might remember from childhood. I assumed the sound was coming from outside the vehicle, perhaps a radio in a passing car or someone in their yard. But when I rolled down the windows to check, the humming continued at exactly the same volume, clearly originating from inside the hearse. When I pulled over and checked the rear compartment, Mrs. Foster lay peaceful and still, exactly as she'd been positioned at the hospital. The humming stopped when I opened the rear door, but resumed as soon as I closed it and continued driving. For the remaining 6 miles to the funeral home, Mrs. Foster's gentle lullaby provided a soundtrack to her final journey. The melody was beautiful, comforting in a way that made the transport feel less like moving a body and more like accompanying someone home. At first, I thought the humming might be some kind of acoustic phenomenon, vibrations from the vehicle's engine, creating sound patterns, or air moving through the casket in ways that mimicked human vocalization. But over the following weeks, I discovered that only certain deceased passengers hummed during transport, and each person had their own distinctive melody. Mr. David Chen, a middle-aged father who died in an accident, hummed what sounded like a children's song, the kind of tune you might sing to help a child fall asleep. 8-year-old Lucy Martinez hummed a simple, repetitive melody that had the quality of something she might have made up herself. Mrs. Sarah Walsh, who'd been a music teacher, hummed classical pieces with perfect pitch and timing. Not everyone hummed. Some passengers rode in complete silence, and I began to notice patterns in who provided their own musical accompaniment. The humming seemed to come from people who'd died suddenly or unexpectedly, or from those who'd been particularly anxious about death during their final illness, as if they were singing to calm themselves during this transition, finding comfort in melodies that had sustained them throughout life. I started paying closer attention to the families when I picked up bodies from the hospital, learning what I could about each person's relationship with music. Mrs. Foster had sung in the church choir for 60 years. Mr. Chen had been known for singing lullabies to his children every night. Lucy Martinez had been taking piano lessons and loved to make up her own songs. Mrs. Walsh had dedicated her career to teaching children the joy of music. The humming appeared to be an extension of these lifelong relationships with melody, a way for musical people to maintain something familiar and comforting during their final journey. 2 months ago, I had an experience that convinced me the humming was more than just acoustic phenomena or my imagination. I was transporting Mr. Robert Morrison, a 72-year-old retired teacher who'd been known throughout the community for his kindness to students and his love of old folk songs. About 3 miles into the journey, Mr. Morrison began humming a tune I recognized, Amazing Grace, rendered with the kind of gentle precision that suggested decades of practice. But as the transport continued, his humming was joined by other voices, soft, distant, but unmistakably present. A chorus of voices harmonizing with Mr. Morrison's lead melody. I pulled over and listened carefully. The sounds were definitely coming from the rear compartment, but they were too complex and coordinated to be explained by mechanical vibrations or audio illusions. Multiple voices, singing in harmony, creating a beautiful choral arrangement of the hymn that Mr. Morrison was humming. When I checked the rear compartment, Mr. Morrison was alone, positioned exactly as he'd been at the hospital. But the harmonizing continued invisible voices supporting his melody, creating the kind of choir that Mr. Morrison had probably imagined during his years of singing in church. I completed the transport accompanied by this supernatural choir, listening to some of the most beautiful music I'd ever heard. The harmony was perfect, the voices blended with professional skill, and the overall effect was profoundly moving, as if Mr. Morrison was being welcomed home by everyone who'd ever shared music with him. Since then, I've learned to listen more carefully during transports, appreciating what I now understand to be final performances by people who'd spent their lives creating and sharing music. The humming isn't random sound, it's intentional expression, a way for musical souls to maintain their connection to something that defined them throughout life. Last week, I transported 6-year-old Tommy Martinez, who died in a playground accident. Tommy had loved to sing, according to his parents, constantly making up songs, humming during breakfast, turning everyday activities into musical adventures. His death was particularly tragic because of his age and the sudden way it happened. As we drove toward the funeral home, Tommy began humming a melody I'd never heard before. Simple, childlike, but incredibly sweet. The tune had the quality of something a 6-year-old might create, innocent and joyful despite the circumstances. But as the transport continued, I realized that Tommy wasn't humming alone. An adult voice had joined him, a woman's voice, gentle and loving, harmonizing with Tommy's childish melody in the way a mother might sing along with her child's made-up songs. The duet was heartbreaking and beautiful, suggesting that Tommy wasn't making his final journey alone, that someone who loved him was singing with him to make the trip less frightening. When I asked Tommy's mother about his relationship with music, she confirmed what I'd suspected. He was always singing, she told me through her tears. I used to sing with him lullabies, made-up songs, anything that made him happy. He had such a beautiful voice for such a little boy. I understood then that the woman's voice I'd heard harmonizing with Tommy was his mother's voice, somehow present to comfort him during his final journey, just as she'd done throughout his short life. Now I approach each transport with different expectations. I listen for the humming, appreciating these final musical expressions as gifts rather than mysterious phenomena. When passengers sing during their journey to the funeral home, I turn off the radio and drive in respectful silence, allowing their music to fill the space. Sometimes I find myself humming along quietly, providing gentle accompaniment to souls who are singing their way from one world to the next. It feels like the right thing to do, a small way of honoring their music and ensuring that no one has to sing alone during their final journey. Some passengers sing lullabies to comfort themselves on their final journey. And sometimes, if you listen carefully and drive with respect, you become part of their choir, helping to carry their music from the world they've left to whatever waits beyond. Some bells ring to honor the forgotten, even when they've been silenced for decades. I'm Boyd Henderson, funeral director at Grace Memorial Chapel, and I've been serving families in their most difficult moments for 19 years. Our chapel was built in 1942 and has provided comfort to thousands of families over the decades. One of its most distinctive features is a bronze bell mounted in the small tower above the main entrance, originally installed to toll during funeral services as a way of announcing the passage of souls from earthly life to eternal rest. The bell served that purpose faithfully until 1987, when we had it disconnected due to noise complaints from neighboring businesses. The mechanism that controlled the tolling was removed. The bell rope was taken down, and the bell itself was left in place purely as architectural decoration. For 37 years, it has remained silent, a beautiful but non-functional reminder of older funeral traditions. 6 months ago, the bell started ringing again. The first time, I assumed it was some kind of mechanical malfunction. I was working late on a Thursday evening, preparing for Friday's services, when I heard a single, clear tone from the chapel bell at exactly midnight. One toll, resonant and solemn, echoing through the quiet building before fading into silence. I checked with our maintenance supervisor the next morning, thinking perhaps wind or thermal expansion had caused some residual mechanism to activate. But when we examined the bell tower, we confirmed what I already knew. There was no mechanism capable of making the bell ring. The bronze bell hung free in its mounting, with no rope, no electronic controls, no mechanical connection that could cause it to toll. Maybe vibration from passing trucks, the maintenance supervisor suggested. Heavy vehicles sometimes create low-frequency vibrations that can affect sensitive objects. But the bell had tolled at midnight, when truck traffic through our area was minimal, and the sound had been too deliberate, too purposeful, to be explained by random vibration. Over the following weeks, the midnight tolling became a regular occurrence. Not every night, but frequently enough that I started noting the dates when it happened. What I discovered was a pattern that made me reconsider everything I thought I understood about death, solitude, and the responsibilities of those who serve the grieving. The bell tolled on nights when someone in our community died alone. Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, an elderly widow with no surviving family, passed away in her sleep on a Tuesday night. The chapel bell tolled once at midnight. Mr. David Chen, a reclusive bachelor who'd lived by himself for 20 years, died of a heart attack in his apartment on Friday evening. The bell tolled at midnight. 8-year-old Sarah Martinez, who died in a car accident while in foster care with no biological family available to claim her, was memorialized by a single toll. At the exact moment her death was officially recorded. Every unexplained toll corresponded with the death of someone who had no immediate family to mourn them, no close friends to arrange their services, no one to ensure their passing was properly acknowledged. The bell was ringing for the forgotten, the isolated, the people whose deaths might otherwise go unmarked, except for official paperwork and brief obituary notices. I started researching each death that coincided with the bell's tolling, confirming what I'd suspected. These were people who would receive minimal funeral services, whose deaths would be witnessed by few, if any, mourners, whose final rest would be largely unattended. The bells seemed to be providing the ceremonial acknowledgement that their lives deserved, but that circumstances had denied them. I brought this discovery to Reverend Patterson, who'd been conducting services at Grace Memorial Chapel for 12 years. He listened to my observations with growing interest and a thoughtful expression that suggested he was connecting my findings to something he'd noticed himself. "I've been wondering about that bell," he admitted. "I've heard it several times during evening prayers, always just that single toll. I assumed it was acoustic effects or building settling, but your explanation makes more sense." Sacred bells have a long history of responding to spiritual needs, particularly in situations where traditional religious observances aren't possible. We decided to research the history of Grace Memorial Chapel, thinking perhaps the bell's current behavior was connected to its original purpose or the intentions of those who'd installed it. What we discovered was that the chapel had been built specifically to serve people who might not otherwise receive proper funeral services: the poor, the isolated, families who couldn't afford elaborate ceremonies but deserved dignified farewells. The bronze bell had been donated by Margaret Grace, a wealthy widow who'd lost her own husband to a sudden illness and had been deeply moved by the number of people in the community who died without adequate memorial services. Her intention was that the bell would toll for every soul that passed through Grace Memorial Chapel, ensuring that no death went unacknowledged, no life concluded without ceremonial recognition. When the bell was disconnected in 1987, that tradition was broken. But apparently, the bell had retained some memory of its original purpose and had begun fulfilling that mission on its own, tolling for people who needed ceremonial acknowledgement, even if they never actually received services at our chapel. Last month, I experienced something that convinced me the bell was more than just a supernatural phenomenon. It was a call to action, a reminder of responsibilities that extended beyond serving only the families who could afford our services. I was working late on a Wednesday evening when the bell tolled at midnight. The next morning, I learned that Mr. Robert Foster, a 78-year-old veteran with no surviving family, had died alone in a nursing home across town. His body was being sent directly to the county crematorium, with no memorial service planned, no acknowledgement of his military service, no recognition of a life that had included sacrifice for his country. I felt compelled to act. Using chapel resources and my own time, I arranged a simple but dignified memorial service for Mr. Foster. I contacted the Veterans Organization to provide military honors, placed a notice in the local newspaper, inviting anyone who'd known him to attend, and ensured that his death received the ceremonial recognition that every veteran deserves. The service was small but meaningful. Several nursing home staff members attended, along with 2 veterans who'd served during the same era and wanted to honor a fellow soldier. It was exactly the kind of funeral that the chapel's original mission had been designed to provide: simple, respectful, ensuring that no death goes completely unmarked. Since then, I've made it part of my practice to investigate when the bell tolls at midnight. I research the deaths that coincide with its ringing and, when possible, arrange simple memorial services for people who would otherwise receive no ceremonial acknowledgement. Not elaborate funerals, we don't have the resources for that, but brief, dignified services that honor the fact that every life deserves recognition, every death deserves witnessing. The bell continues to toll at midnight for the forgotten dead. But now, instead of just noting these mysterious tolls, I respond to them as calls to service, reminders that my work extends beyond serving families who seek us out, to include honoring those who have no one left to arrange their final farewell. Some bells ring to honor the forgotten, even when they've been silenced for decades. And sometimes, if you listen carefully to those midnight tolls, you can hear not just a bell ringing, but a calling to ensure that every soul receives the dignity and recognition they deserve, regardless of whether anyone is left alive to provide it. Some paperwork arrives before the deaths it documents have actually occurred. I'm Iris Chen, records clerk at Riverside Funeral Home, and I've been managing burial documentation and family arrangements for 7 years. My work involves maintaining detailed files for every service we provide, coordinating with cemetery offices, and ensuring that all legal and administrative requirements are met before, during, and after each funeral. It's precise work that requires attention to detail and understanding that these documents represent final chapters in human lives. Our filing system follows strict chronological order, with current cases organized by date of death and scheduled service times. Historical records are archived by year, and everything is cross-referenced to ensure that families can access information about their loved ones, even decades after burial. The system works efficiently because it's based on fixed dates and unchangeable facts. 3 months ago, I started receiving burial documentation for people who were still alive. The first incident involved Mrs. Dorothy Martinez, an 84-year-old woman living in assisted care across town. I received complete burial paperwork for Mrs. Martinez, filed under tomorrow's date, including death certificate, burial permit, and family contact information. The documentation appeared to be legitimate, proper official signatures, correct formatting, appropriate seal stamps. But Mrs. Martinez was, according to my verification calls, very much alive and in stable health. I assumed the paperwork was misfiled, perhaps intended for someone with a similar name or accidentally dated with the wrong information. These kinds of administrative errors happen occasionally in the funeral business, and I made a note to contact the issuing offices to correct the documentation. But the next morning, Mrs. Martinez's daughter called to inform us that her mother had passed away peacefully during the night, exactly on the date indicated in the burial papers I'd received 24 hours earlier. I might have dismissed this as an unusual coincidence, but similar documentation began arriving regularly. Death certificates dated for tomorrow, burial permits for people who were currently alive, family contact sheets for arrangements that hadn't yet been requested. All professionally prepared, all legally formatted, all proving to be accurate when the predicted deaths actually occurred. The paperwork always arrived exactly 1 day before the death it documented. Never longer, never shorter, just 24 hours of advance notice for deaths that hadn't yet happened, but inevitably would occur exactly as the documentation specified. I started keeping detailed records of these advance filings, documenting the arrival times, and comparing them to actual death notifications when they came through official channels. The correlation was perfect. Every piece of advanced documentation proved to be completely accurate when the anticipated death occurred the following day. The death certificates contained information that shouldn't have been available until after medical examination: exact time of death, precise cause, attending physician signatures. The burial permits included plot assignments and cemetery coordination details that typically require family input and administrative processing. The family contact sheets listed next of kin information and service preferences that could only be known through direct communication with relatives. I brought these irregularities to Director Walsh, who examined the documentation with growing concern. "This is highly unusual, Iris. These documents appear to be legitimate, but they're arriving through our normal processing channels for deaths that haven't happened yet. We need to understand how this is possible. We decided to trace the source of the advanced documentation by monitoring our incoming mail and delivery systems more carefully. What we discovered was that the papers appeared in our filing system overnight, placed in appropriate folders as if they'd been processed through normal administrative channels, but with no record of how they'd arrived or who had filed them. Security cameras showed no one accessing the filing area during overnight hours. The building remained locked, and our alarm system showed no unauthorized entry. The documents simply materialized in the correct files, professionally prepared and properly organized, ready for processing as soon as the predicted deaths occurred. The pattern continued over several weeks, and I began to recognize the characteristics of people who received advanced documentation. They were typically elderly individuals living alone, people with terminal illnesses who were approaching the end of their lives, or those in situations where death was expected, but not precisely predictable. The documentation seemed to appear for people who needed extra administrative preparation to ensure their final arrangements would be handled properly. Most disturbing was what happened when I called the phone numbers listed on the family contact sheets to verify the information. When I reached the supposedly living individuals whose deaths were documented for the following day, they answered their phones, but sounded different, distant, as if speaking from very far away, or through some kind of interference. "Mrs. Sarah Foster?" I would ask, reading from documentation that predicted her death within 24 hours. "Yes, this is Sarah," would come the response, but the voice always had an unusual quality, fainter than normal conversation, with strange echoes or background sounds that I couldn't identify. The conversations were brief, with the individuals confirming their information but seeming disoriented or confused about why I was calling. "I'm just verifying some paperwork for our records," I would explain, not wanting to upset anyone by mentioning burial documentation. "Oh, yes, the paperwork," they would respond, as if they understood exactly what I meant. "Everything should be in order. Thank you for taking care of things." When these individuals died the following day, their families would contact us to arrange services, and the documentation that had mysteriously appeared in our files proved to be completely accurate for every detail they requested. 2 months ago, I decided to investigate one of these cases more thoroughly. I received advanced documentation from Mr. Thomas Walsh, a 76-year-old retired teacher who was supposedly scheduled to die the next evening at 8:47 p.m. The paperwork was more detailed than usual, including specific information about his preferred funeral music, flower arrangements, and even the text for his obituary. I called Mr. Walsh's listed number to verify the information. When he answered, his voice had that same distant quality I'd noticed in previous calls, but this time I paid closer attention to the background sounds. I could hear what sounded like soft music hymns, maybe, or classical pieces and voices speaking in hushed, respectful tones, as if he were already at some kind of memorial gathering. "Mr. Walsh, I'm calling to verify some information we have on file," I said, trying to understand the unusual acoustic environment. "Yes, dear. I've been expecting your call," he replied in that faint, echoing voice. "Everything is prepared exactly as it should be. The music selections are correct. The flowers should be white roses. And please make sure the obituary mentions my 43 years of teaching. The children always meant so much to me." "Mr. Walsh, are you feeling all right? You sound like you might be in a large room or—" "I'm exactly where I need to be," he said gently. "Thank you for making sure everything is properly arranged. It brings such peace to know that the details will be handled correctly." The line went dead. When I tried calling back, there was no answer. Mr. Walsh died the next evening at 8:47 p.m., exactly as documented. His family contacted us the following morning to arrange services, requesting white roses, specific hymns, and an obituary that emphasized his teaching career. Every detail matched the advanced documentation perfectly. But what convinced me that something supernatural was happening was what Mr. Walsh's daughter told me when she came to finalize the arrangements. "It's strange," she said, "but Dad called me yesterday evening, just a few hours before he passed. He said he wanted to make sure I knew how much he loved teaching, how proud he was of all his students over the years. It was like he was saying goodbye, but also like he was dictating his own obituary." She paused, looking puzzled. "He also said something odd. He told me not to worry about the funeral arrangements, that everything had already been taken care of, that someone would make sure all the details were handled properly." I didn't understand what he meant at the time. I understood. Mr. Walsh had been preparing his own documentation from whatever place souls occupy during the transition from life to death, ensuring that his final arrangements would reflect his personality and values, even if his family didn't know his specific preferences. Last week, I received the most detailed advanced documentation yet. A complete funeral service plan for Mrs. Margaret Chen, including specific readings, musical selections, flower arrangements, and a handwritten letter to be read at her service. The letter was in her own handwriting, though she was still alive when the documentation arrived. When I called Mrs. Chen to verify the information, she answered in that familiar distant voice and said something that made me understand the true nature of what was happening. "I'm so grateful for this opportunity to arrange my own farewell properly. It's a gift to be able to ensure that everything reflects what matters most to me." I realized that the advanced documentation wasn't appearing randomly or through some administrative error. The people who were approaching death were somehow being given the opportunity to prepare their own final arrangements, to ensure that their funerals would reflect their personalities, values, and wishes, even if their families didn't know those details. Mrs. Chen died peacefully 2 days later, and her service was exactly what she had specified in the advanced documentation. A beautiful reflection of her life, interests, and relationships that brought comfort to her family and friends. Now I treat the advanced documentation as a service rather than an anomaly. When burial papers arrive for living individuals, I file them carefully and treat them as final requests from people who are preparing for their transition from life to death. The documentation represents their last chance to ensure that their funerals will honor their lives appropriately. Some paperwork arrives before the deaths it documents have actually occurred. But I've learned that this advanced filing system serves an important purpose. It allows people to participate in planning their own farewells, ensuring that their final services reflect who they truly were and what mattered most to them during their time on Earth. Some flowers wilt to reveal the unfinished business that keeps souls from resting. I'm Luz Rodriguez, flower coordinator at Harmony Memorial Services, and I've been creating funeral arrangements for 11 years. My work involves designing floral displays that honor the deceased while providing comfort to grieving families. Every arrangement tells a story. The bright sunflowers for someone who loved gardening, the elegant white roses for a formal personality, the mixed wildflowers for a free spirit who preferred natural beauty to structured perfection. Flowers have their own language in funeral work. Colors convey specific meanings. Flower types suggest personality traits. And the way arrangements age during and after services can reflect the emotional atmosphere of each farewell. I've learned to read these signals, to understand what flowers are communicating about the people they honor and the families who mourn them. 4 months ago, I started noticing that certain funeral arrangements wilted unnaturally fast, but only those meant for people who died with unfinished business. The first time was during the service for Mr. David Walsh, a 62-year-old businessman who died suddenly of a heart attack. I'd created a sophisticated arrangement of white lilies and blue roses, reflecting his professional demeanor and the formal atmosphere his family wanted for the service. The flowers were fresh that morning, carefully chosen, and properly conditioned to last through the viewing and burial. But by the time the service began, the arrangement had started to deteriorate in an unusual way. The flowers weren't simply wilting from heat or age, they were turning black from the center outward, as if some kind of darkness was spreading through each bloom. The effect was striking and disturbing, like watching ink spill across white paper in slow motion. I assumed there was something wrong with the flowers themselves, perhaps a disease or chemical contamination that I hadn't noticed when arranging them. But when I examined the blackened petals more closely, I found no evidence of disease, insects, or chemical damage. The flowers were simply dying in a pattern I'd never seen before. The family noticed the dying arrangement and were understandably upset. Mrs. Walsh approached me after the service with tears in her eyes. "Is this some kind of sign?" she asked. David always worried that he hadn't finished everything he needed to do. He died so suddenly, with so many things left undone. I replaced the arrangement with fresh flowers for the burial. But the same thing happened. Beautiful white lilies turning black from the center outward, spreading darkness across the entire display, as if the flowers were absorbing something toxic from the atmosphere around Mr. Walsh's casket. Over the following weeks, I observed this phenomenon with several other arrangements. Always the same pattern. Flowers turning black from the center outward. Always for people who died suddenly or unexpectedly. Always when families mentioned unfinished business or unresolved issues in the deceased person's life. Mrs. Helen Chen's roses blackened during her service, and her daughter later told me that Mrs. Chen had been working on a reconciliation with her estranged sister, but had died before they could make peace. Young Tommy Martinez's sunflowers darkened, while his parents spoke about the college applications he'd never submitted, the dreams he'd never had the chance to pursue. Each blackened arrangement seemed to correspond with incomplete relationships, unfulfilled promises, or important tasks that death had interrupted. I started documenting these incidents, photographing the arrangements before and after services to track the progression of the blackening effect. What I discovered was that the darkness always appeared during the most emotional moments of each service, when families spoke about regrets, unfinished conversations, or things they wished they'd been able to say to their loved ones. The flowers seemed to be absorbing and reflecting the spiritual weight of incompletion, becoming visual representations of souls that couldn't rest because of unresolved earthly concerns. I brought my observations to Director Morrison, who'd been running Harmony Memorial Services for 28 years. He examined my photographs with growing interest and a thoughtful expression that suggested he'd noticed similar patterns in other aspects of funeral work. "You know, Luz, we've been seeing other unusual phenomena lately," he told me. Bodies that seem restless during viewings. Families reporting dreams where the deceased asks them to complete specific tasks. Even some instances where personal belongings have moved or disappeared from caskets. Your flower observations might be part of a larger pattern. We decided to research the backgrounds of people whose funeral arrangements had blackened, trying to understand what specific types of unfinished business might be causing these supernatural manifestations. What we found was that the blackening occurred most often for people who died with important relationships unresolved, significant promises unfulfilled, or critical information that they'd never shared with their families. Mr. Walsh had been planning to tell his wife about a secret savings account he'd established for their grandchildren's education. Mrs. Chen had been writing a letter of reconciliation to her sister, but had died before sending it. Tommy Martinez had been accepted to his dream college, but had died before telling his parents about the scholarship he'd received. These were people whose deaths had interrupted crucial communications or prevented them from completing actions that would have brought peace to their relationships or closure to important chapters in their lives. Last month, I experienced something that convinced me the blackening flowers were more than just unusual phenomena. They were signals that the deceased needed help completing their unfinished business. I was preparing arrangements for the service of Mrs. Sarah Foster, an elderly woman who died alone in her apartment. The family had mentioned that Mrs. Foster had been somewhat reclusive in her final years, with few close relationships and limited communication with relatives. They expected a simple service, with minimal attendance. As I worked on Mrs. Foster's arrangement Pink Roses and Baby's Breath, reflecting the gentle personality her family had described. I noticed the flowers beginning to darken even before the service began. The blackening was more dramatic than I'd seen before, spreading rapidly through the entire arrangement until the beautiful pink roses had become dark, withered reminders of something unresolved. During the service, Mrs. Foster's niece approached me about the unusual flower condition. "This is so strange," she said. "Aunt Sarah always took such good care of her flowers. She had the most beautiful garden, and everything she touched seemed to bloom. It's almost like these flowers are trying to tell us something." After the service, I decided to visit Mrs. Foster's apartment, thinking perhaps there was something in her living space that might explain the connection between her unfinished business and the blackened flowers. The building manager let me in to look for any items that might be important to the family. In Mrs. Foster's bedroom, I found a small wooden box, hidden in her closet, filled with letters she'd written but never sent. Dozens of them, addressed to family members, old friends, former neighbors, all expressing love, gratitude, apologies, and important information that she'd apparently been too shy or afraid to share while alive. One letter was addressed to the niece who'd attended the service, expressing Mrs. Foster's pride in her accomplishments and her regret that they hadn't stayed in closer contact. Another was for a childhood friend, sharing memories and asking for forgiveness for some long-ago misunderstanding. There were letters to charities she'd wanted to support, instructions for care of her garden, and even a letter to the mailman, thanking him for his kindness during her final years. I brought the letters to Mrs. Foster's family, explaining that I'd found them while looking for items that might be meaningful for the memorial. As her niece read through the correspondence, tears streamed down her face. "These are exactly what we needed to hear," she told me. "Aunt Sarah always seemed so distant, so formal. We thought she didn't care about maintaining relationships. But these letters show how much she loved us, how much she wanted to stay connected but didn't know how to express it." The family decided to fulfill Mrs. Foster's wishes by delivering the letters to their intended recipients and donating to the charities she'd mentioned. They also took over care of her garden, ensuring that her flowers would continue to bloom as a living memorial to her gentle spirit. When I returned to the funeral home the next day, I found that the arrangement from Mrs. Foster's service had transformed overnight. The blackened roses had returned to their original pink color, looking fresh and vibrant, as if they'd just been cut from a garden. The restoration was complete and beautiful, suggesting that Mrs. Foster's unfinished business had been resolved through the delivery of her unsent letters. Now I pay closer attention to arrangements that begin to blacken, treating them as signals that the deceased needs help completing important unfinished business. When families notice the unusual flower behavior, I gently suggest that there might be things their loved one wanted to say or do that could still be accomplished through the living. Some flowers wilt to reveal the unfinished business that keeps souls from resting. But I've learned that when families take action to complete those interrupted tasks, to deliver unspoken messages or fulfill unfulfilled promises, the flowers can bloom again, evidence that love transcends death, and that some business can be finished even after the person who started it has moved on to whatever comes next. Some hands refuse to rest, even when their work on earth is finished. I'm Roy Patterson, maintenance worker at Clearwater Funeral Home, and I've been doing the closing rounds for 10 years. My job involves securing the building each night, checking that all viewing rooms are properly arranged for the next day's services, ensuring that the preparation areas are clean and organized, and making sure that everything is locked down safely for the evening hours. The final check is always the same routine. Walk through each viewing room, verify that caskets are properly positioned and secured, dim the lights to an appropriate level for overnight hours, and lock each door before moving to the next area. It's quiet work that requires attention to detail and respect for the solemnity of the spaces I'm securing. 3 months ago, I started finding the same casket lid slightly ajar every night during my closing rounds. The casket, belonged to Mr. David Morrison, a 78-year-old retired carpenter who died peacefully after a long illness. His family had chosen a beautiful mahogany casket with bronze hardware, befitting someone who'd spent his career working with wood and appreciated fine craftsmanship. The casket was positioned in Viewing Room 2, scheduled for a service the following afternoon. The first time I found the lid ajar, I assumed that someone from the preparation staff had checked on Mr. Morrison and had failed to secure the casket properly. It happens occasionally, a small oversight in an otherwise meticulous process. I closed the lid carefully, ensuring that the locking mechanism was properly engaged, and completed my rounds without giving it much thought. But the next night, the casket lid was open again. Just slightly, perhaps an inch, but clearly not in the fully closed and locked position where I'd left it. I checked the lid more carefully this time, examining the hardware to make sure there wasn't a mechanical problem that might cause it to open on its own. The locking mechanism appeared to be functioning normally, and the lid closed securely when I engaged it. The pattern continued every night for a week. No matter how carefully I secured Mr. Morrison's casket during my evening rounds, I would find it slightly open the following night. Always the same amount, just enough to create a small gap between the lid and the base, as if someone had opened it partway and then stopped. I mentioned the issue to Director Walsh, thinking perhaps there was a problem with the casket hardware that needed professional attention. But when he examined the locking mechanism, he found it to be in perfect working condition. "These are high-quality caskets," he told me. "The hardware doesn't fail unless there's significant damage or wear, and this one is practically new." I started paying closer attention to Mr. Morrison's casket during my rounds, looking for any signs of what might be causing it to open. What I discovered was more disturbing than a mechanical malfunction. When I approached the casket each night, I could see that the lid was slightly ajar, but as I got closer, I could glimpse movement inside. Not dramatic motion, but subtle shifts, the suggestion of a hand moving just enough to catch the light differently. Fingers that seemed to adjust position as if seeking a more comfortable arrangement. Mr. Morrison had been a carpenter for 52 years, and his hands showed the evidence of that lifetime of work. Calloused palms, strong fingers, the kind of hands that had built countless projects and solved thousands of practical problems. Even in death, his hands looked capable, positioned across his chest in the traditional arrangement, but somehow retaining the appearance of tools that were ready to be used. When I examined the casket more closely, I noticed something that made me reconsider what I was witnessing. The interior of the casket near Mr. Morrison's hands showed small scratches in the satin lining, not damage from preparation or handling, but the kind of marks that might be made by someone working with their hands. Feeling around in the dark, searching for something familiar, I decided to research Mr. Morrison's background, thinking perhaps understanding his personality and life story might help explain why his casket kept opening and why his hands seemed to be moving. What I learned was that Mr. Morrison had been a compulsive problem solver, someone who couldn't rest when there was work to be done or projects left unfinished. His son told me stories about how Mr. Morrison would wake up in the middle of the night with ideas for solving construction problems, how he'd spent his retirement years fixing things for neighbors and family members who needed his expertise. Dad's hands were never still, his son explained. Even when he was watching television or sitting at the dinner table, he'd be turning a screwdriver or handling some small tool. His hands needed to be working. The night before Mr. Morrison's service, I decided to stay late and observe his casket more carefully, trying to understand what was causing the lid to open and what his hands might be searching for in the darkness. I positioned myself in the adjacent hallway where I could watch Viewing Room 2 without being directly visible. Around 11 o'clock, I saw the casket lid begin to move, slowly, deliberately, rising just enough to create that familiar gap. In the dim lighting of the viewing room, I could see Mr. Antony Morrison's right hand moving inside the casket, reaching upward as if he were trying to lift something or work on some invisible project. His movements were purposeful, not the random motions of a body settling or responding to temperature changes. He was working with his hands, using the skills that had defined his entire adult life, trying to complete some task that death hadn't allowed him to finish. I approached the casket quietly, watching as Mr. Morrison's hands continued their mysterious work. As I got closer, I could see that he was making the precise, careful movements of someone using tools, the delicate adjustments of a craftsman working on a detailed project, the patient manipulation of materials that required exact positioning. But there were no tools in the casket, no materials to work with. Mr. Morrison's hands were moving through empty air, performing the motions of carpentry without any physical objects to manipulate. He was practicing his craft, maintaining the hand coordination that had been central to his identity, refusing to let death interrupt the work that had given his life meaning. I whispered to him, speaking as I might to a living person who was concentrating on a difficult task. "Mr. Morrison, your work is finished. You built a good life, created beautiful things, helped countless people with your skills. It's time to rest." His hands paused in their motion, fingers spreading as if he were setting down invisible tools. The casket lid began to close slowly, and I could see his face relax into a more peaceful expression, as if he'd finally received permission to stop working and allow himself to rest. The following morning, I found Mr. Morrison's casket properly closed and locked, with no signs of the restless movement that had characterized the previous nights. His service proceeded without incident, and his family spoke beautifully about his dedication to his craft and his generous spirit in using his skills to help others. But that wasn't the end of similar incidents. Over the following months, I've encountered other cases where the deceased seemed unable to let go of the activities that had defined their earthly lives. Mrs. Helen Foster, a seamstress, was found with her hands positioned as if she were still stitching. Dr. Richard Chen's hands moved as if he were examining patients or writing prescriptions. 8-year-old Lucy Martinez's small fingers seemed to be playing invisible piano keys, practicing the music lessons that had been so important to her short life. Each time, I've learned to speak gently to these restless souls, acknowledging their dedication to their work or passions, while encouraging them to find peace in the knowledge that their earthly contributions were complete and valued. Now I approach my closing rounds with different expectations. When I find casket lids ajar or glimpse hands that seem to be working on invisible projects, I don't just secure the hardware and move on. I take time to acknowledge the deceased person's life work, to thank them for their contributions, and to reassure them that it's safe to rest. Some hands refuse to rest, even when their work on earth is finished. But I've learned that sometimes all they need is recognition for their lifelong dedication and permission to finally put down the tools that defined their earthly purpose.